BP agreeing to put $20 billion in escrow for spill claims. This move comes a day before the CEO, Tony Hayward, testifies before the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. Joining us from Capitol Hill, two members of that committee who will be sitting across from Mr. Hayward tomorrow, Democratic Congressman Peter Welch of Vermont and Republican Congressman John Sullivan of Oklahoma. The majority gets to go first here, Congressman Sullivan, I suppose. Let me ask Mr. Welch what your first question will be to Tony Hayward tomorrow.
Well, you know, Tony Hayward's got to acknowledge that this happened as a result of recklessness and negligence by BP. It is good news that they're going to be willing to put an escrow fund to establish a compensation fund for the families that have been injured and also to pay for the cost of the cleanup. But the bottom line is Congress has to ask the question, do we want to continue subsidizing a profitable industry, $67 billion in profits, $37 billion in dividends, $20 billion in buybacks, with billions of dollars of taxpayer subsidy, or should we steer that money towards a new clean energy economy in the future? That's a question we have to ask, and I'll highlight that in the hearing.
Congressman Sullivan, same question to you. What do you want to hear from Mr. Hayward?
Well, I think that we first need to find out when we're going to get this hole plugged. I think we need to stop the leak. That's the paramount issue right now, is stopping this leak and letting people in the Gulf get some relief. I mean, there's businesses, families are being affected by this, and that needs to stop. Also, I'd like to ask him, why is BP's record on safety so spotty? If you compare them to others in the industry, like ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, others, they are far and above worse violators of OSHA rules and everything like that. I think they cut corners. I also think that they are just, in it for the money to cut these corners and jeopardize safety, and that's not right. I think it's a cultural issue inside BP. It's not an issue in the oil and gas industry.
Congressman Welch, even with this new escrow account, we got flooded with emails from viewers who want to know whether or not BP will still be allowed to pay a dividend. Given what we know now, should they be allowed to pay the dividend or not?
Look, every good corporation has to meet its obligations first and then pay dividends from reserves. And unfortunately, I believe that the shareholders are among the victims of the BP negligence that John just talked about. We've got to set aside the cash to make sure that we know they can cover the cost of the cleanup and to compensate the victims in the Gulf. That's an obligation of the corporation.
Congressman Sullivan, do you think there is any political will to go the nuclear option? And by nuclear option, I mean terminating BP's oil and gas leases, or maybe even suspending their federal contracts?
Well, I think we have to be careful here. The government, encroaching on, again, another private industry. The government's already taken over auto industry, financial institutions. Now I feel they want to take over an energy company, and we don't want to see that. I think that it's up to them whether they pay their dividend. They do have obligations they need to honor, and they need to clean this mess up. They need to be responsible for all the claims, responsible claims, and pay them. But, that's why I'm concerned a little bit about the $20 billion escrow account. I don't want the government taking this over, and ultimately the taxpayer will be on the hook for this cleanup.
Well, apparently
the taxpayer shouldn't pay a dime of this.
Apparently that's one of the things that are being negotiated right now, is whether or not the government would be able to go back to BP regardless of this $20 billion escrow account. It sounds as though you think, Congressman, that they should be able to go back to BP.
Well,
is that correct?
how do we know if this amount's the right amount? We don't know. Also, it's going to open this up for trial lawyers to get a big bite out of it. I think all this money should be dedicated to legitimate claims for the people who are suffering down there. They need to get that money, not trial lawyers and the government getting involved, and then also ultimately putting the taxpayer on the hook. That's wrong.
Congressman Sullivan, great point on BP's environmental record, which goes back to the explosion in Houston. Up in Prudhoe, they had a spill there. Mr. Welch, very quickly, does the government have the power to compel BP not to pay a dividend to shareholders, or is it really just a case of using the bully pulpit to persuade them not to?
Well, it's really two things. I think one is the bully pulpit, but the other is standard creditor-debtor relationships. If somebody owes you a lot of money and they're about to take the assets and get rid of them so they can't pay you, you can go to court and get what's called a trustee process, and that may be the case here. The government has no business taking over BP, but it has a real obligation to make sure that the folks along the Gulf Coast are compensated, and that means that BP should be stepping up, and they've given assurances that they will pay these obligations. obligations. But if they put money in escrow, they put the dividend into escrow, then that'll be a financial step that's consistent with their verbal assurances.
Congressman Welch, thank you very much. Congressman Sullivan, we'll be watching tomorrow. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We appreciate it very much.